Germany, London, Philly, Indonesia, Estonia, amazing. People from all over, New York City, Texas, fantastic. Well, I'm going to go ahead and dive straight into everything because we have a ton of ground to cover, a lot to unpack today. I did have to just interrupt Pippa and Julie and ask them to stop their conversation for a second because I was like, this is everything that I want for the event. And let's go ahead and get live. Just to set the stage today, I'm going to give a quick introduction before passing the mic off to Julie and Pippa. If we haven't connected before, my name is Kelly and I'm the founder and executive director of Impact Travel Alliance. Some very, very quick housekeeping. We do have AI generated closed captions today. I'm going to go ahead and throw the instructions into the chat. If you need help turning those on, feel free to message me in the chat and I can help you get those set up. But those instructions should be enough to be able to get you up and running with those closed captions. Can I get a quick kind of poll from the audience? Is this your first Impact Travel Alliance event or have you been to one before? Maybe if it's your first one, type in yes. If you've been to one before, type in no. Okay, we have one person who's been yes, yes. Yes, you can turn off the closed captions as well in the same settings. Looks like we have a good mix of maybe 50-50%. So if you are not familiar with Impact Travel Alliance, ITA is a global community and nonprofit that's aimed at improving the world through travel. So that's no small feat. And there's certainly a lot of ways that we can go about doing that. So to break it down a bit, the way that we do it at Impact Travel Alliance is specifically by educating travelers how to explore in a way that has a positive impact on local communities and our environment. This topic that we're talking about today is special to me for a lot of reasons. I know that Julie was just talking about Jinja with Pippa before we came live. Uganda is actually one of the trips that I credit as a catalyst for ideas that eventually fueled Impact Travel Alliance. I was fortunate enough to work with a sustainable tourism company over there for about 6 weeks or so. And I saw firsthand how travel, when done mindfully, can have a really positive impact on the local community and the environment. So my experiences in Uganda were guerrilla trekking, cooking classes, connecting with local artists. And one thing that I found kind of really profound in just shaping my career is that when I came back from Uganda and I started talking about all of these impactful experiences, so many people came back to me and they were like, oh my God, I went on a voluntourism trip as well. And that was kind of like, no, like that's not what I was talking about. I'm talking about actual just like going and taking a cooking class or eating a meal out somewhere and how that has a positive impact on the world through those immersive travel experiences. So it was this really interesting space where I was talking about Uganda and impact, and all that Westerners heard was voluntourism. So I started writing articles and hosting events with the goal of really just reshaping the narrative around sustainable travel. And at the core of the work, there was this theme that was centered around mainstreaming sustainability so that we can think about how we can apply impact into any destination, travel style, or budget. And that's really the ethos that ITA exists as today and what really all of our content and programming is centered around. So again, we tend to correlate doing good with within the travel industry with impact-focused experiences like voluntourism, but there's so many other ways that we can have a positive impact on our world. And that's really all of the content that we talked about to date with Impact Travel Alliance. But I digress. All of this is to say that we've never really talked about voluntourism with Impact Travel Alliance. So this month is actually the first time that we've been tackling this concept of voluntourism, unpacking it, talking about the ethics behind it. And the organization just turned 6 years old this April. But it was in the early years that I actually connected with Pippa. I was asked to speak on a voluntourism panel, and I was kind of like, why am I being asked to speak on a voluntourism panel? This is not what I am campaigning around. Of course, then Pippa tells me she's writing a book on voluntourism, and I was like, oh, great. But of course, you can't judge a book by its cover. And I quickly learned that Pippa had a thoughtful eye and very humble approach to discussing voluntourism. And years later, we're still friends, and I'm lucky to have had a sneak preview of reading her book, which I highly, highly, highly recommend. By the way, today's event is the launch of Ours to Explore, Privilege, Power, and the Paradox of Voluntourism. And all of our attendees will receive a discount code following the event to purchase the book. So I mentioned that ITA launched as an event series in New York City. And today the organization has grown to a global organization with more than 30 local chapters around the world. We've hosted more than 400 events with nearly 38,000 attendees in total. All this is to say that the organization has grown to something much bigger than just an event. We're a community, and we're a movement of travelers who are advocating for a stronger and better industry. I like to say that ITA is a global platform for local voices. And so with this event in particular, I'm really grateful to have Julie here joining us as our moderator and guiding today's discussion. Julie is a Nairobi-based travel and culture writer. I have an immense respect for her work and her approach to how she's tackling very complex ideas and telling stories in a very creative way. And I cannot wait to have her guide this discussion with Pippa. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic off to the two of you. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Very nice to see so many of you here. I'll just quickly introduce myself, my background, and then let Pippa do the same. So my name is Julie, as Kelly said, Julie Olum. Born and bred in Nairobi, Kenya, which is where I am calling you from right now. It's our 6 p.m. So a nice little evening chat for us. So yeah, I do have my background in travel and culture writing, although I have a degree in architecture too. That's a different story for a different day. I do a lot of work and writing and creative work around decolonizing travel in the global south. So that involves the rest of East Africa, wider Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, South America, Pacific Islands. I'm very interested in sort of changing the narratives behind travel, and also changing the way that people travel, and empowering people from those places to travel as well. I also share a lot of budget and solo travel if you're into that, as I'm the hands and face and voice behind Frame Ambition on the internet. And also quite an avid budget and long-term traveler. So I've done my fair share of volunteering in a bartering kind of way, which is what we were talking about before the chat. I did spend a good 7 months of last year in Jinja, Uganda, which we'll get into. It's in the east of Uganda, and very, very major stop or hotspot for Christian evangelical missions and other sorts of voluntourism. So we'll get into that as one of these points that seems to be very popular with this huge industry. Really glad to be here. Thanks again for joining us on this chat, and I'll let Pippa say hello too.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you guys all for joining and jumping in. I'm really hoping that we can have a tough and interesting and engaging conversation. This is Ours to Explore, 6 years in the making. So I first wrote about voluntourism in 2014 in what can really kindly be called a rant. That was called The Problem with Little White Girls, and was basically a reflection on the frustrations that I had with the experience that I had had as a voluntourist as a teenager, both in Tanzania and the Dominican Republic, that I really had never processed those experiences, but I knew that there was something about them that was inherently wrong, and was trying to make sense of that. And my 800-word rant went viral in the way that things did in 2014. And very quickly, I was thrust onto a global stage as a quote-unquote expert on a subject that I actually thought I had invented the word voluntourism when I used it in the blog post, until I Googled it and realized that it was, in fact, a common portmanteau, and I'm not a genius. And so I started speaking as an expert on a subject that I was not at all an expert about, and realized very quickly that if this was something that I actually wanted to engage with in an intellectual way, I had to become an intellectual about it. And so I've spent a lot of the last 6 years trying to understand the personal aspects of voluntourism, but also the broader mechanisms that allow a multi-billion-dollar industry to exist built on good intentions, but that rarely, if ever, does any good. And for me, that is really the framework from which I approach ours to explore. The intentions behind the vast majority of people's actions in voluntourism are very good, and that's a beautiful thing in the sense that good intentions are a great thing. But allowing intention to lead and determine action has actually been causing us a lot of problems historically as a species. And my hope with ours to explore and with conversations like this is to engage with travel-oriented and minded people around how we can actually do better, how we can help others do better, how we cannot halt a many, many, many trillion-dollar business globally, which is tourism, but we can make it something that does a lot less harm than it does right now. And the little niche that I focus on, that is voluntourism, and I'm just excited to dive in and talk about tough stuff.
Sweet, thank you. So I'm not sure if we're going to, allow questions and comments right in the chat. I think that if there's any comments that come up immediately while we're speaking, you guys are free to pop those in and we'll try to catch them. But I think we will also leave time for questions and answers at the end of the discussion. And so, yeah, first of all, I'm going to say congratulations on finishing a book, Pippa. We're here to launch Ours to Explore. Hang on, let me read the whole title. Hold on. Privilege, Power, and the Paradox of Voluntourism. I really should have had that down by now. It's fine. It's fine. You're on mute.
Sorry, I mess it up all the time, to be fair. I'm also muting periodically because my dog has very strong opinions on voluntourism.
Okay. So I had the opportunity to read this book over the past few weeks and enjoyed it very much. Learned quite a lot about the very history of voluntourism, but even before that, what sort of led up to it. There are mentions of British society in the 19th century, a lady named Mary Carpenter who, sort of had these dreams of doing good in the world and, spreading the message of Christianity and helping, impoverished children in Britain. And she ended up in India, kind of going back and forth very much. And a lot of her work involved sort of teaching particularly Indian women and I suppose children a little bit, but really it was the right way to do things is the British way to do things. So certain things that were ordinary in India at the time, like for example, men doing laundry or, things like women not necessarily knowing needlework or any crafts that a British respectable lady would know. This was all wrong. And Mary Carpenter said, okay, we're going to sort this out. You have to do laundry. The man can't do laundry. You need to learn needlework and whatever else in order to be proper the way that we do it at home. And that was sort of like one very early example of sort of showing up in a place, staying in an environment that was close enough to home. She would stay in hotels or homes of British people so that she was kind of far away, but it was not too foreign. It's like hot outside, but we have a fan in here and, it's not so savage. And I'm very interested to sort of hear about your research into the very beginnings of what was to become voluntourism and what that process was like.
Yeah, so it surprises a lot of people that the first 20-ish pages of the book take place prior to the 20th century. And people have for a long time thought of voluntourism as something that was created in our time. That's a modern invention. People often have tagged it to the rise of ecotourism in the 80s and alternative travel and sustainable tourism. What I found while I was doing research, which for context, I'm a complete research nerd. So in my normal day-to-day life, I run an antiques business with my husband. And we write columns on antiques. So I will do just about anything to spend 8 hours in a research library. And what I found while researching were all these references to this guy, Thomas Cook. And I had no idea who he was, but I did know there was at the time, now defunct as of 2019, a massive travel company called Thomas Cook. And I wanted to figure out what that link was. Was it the same Thomas Cook? And why did he keep coming up and popping up in literature coming out of academia about voluntourism? And the reason why is because really he invented it. Obviously, people traveled with the intention of impacting the places that they went prior to the Industrial Revolution, especially missionaries. But it wasn't something that was widely accessible. It wasn't something that was really commercializable. You could not make it a product and a commodity because travel was just too difficult. And what I found really fascinating was that in the 1840s, you really have this confluence of travel becoming easier and religion shifting in this really important way. By religion, I'm specifically speaking to Christianity and a new sort of, it's called the Second Great Awakening, the sort of new evangelical ethos, which took the practice of religion, decentered it out of the church and said you can actually practice your faith anywhere that you go. And sort of that's the way that you can show your care for God. And so you have Industrial Revolution, increased ability to travel, you have this evangelical ethos, and you have this man who thinks to himself, you know, I might be able to combine those two things to create good in the world. And really from the get-go, his intention was to create good for his customers. So he wanted his travelers to become better people, not necessarily the communities they went to. That would be a benefit, but the goal was for his customers to be better people. By better people, he really meant stop drinking. He was a very avid teetotaler, but to him, that was better people. And that framework, when we think about the 1840s, is also deeply embedded in the colonialist framework, because why were they able to start going to these places? Why was India somewhere that once the Suez Canal opened later was super accessible? It's because of the colonial empire. So mass tourism exists because colonialism exists. Voluntourism exists because colonialism exists. And they're not new things. They're in fact just continuations of the way that we've always been doing things. And when we think about voluntourism as a new thing, it really does a disservice to the conversation because it decontextualizes something that is extremely deep in our human psyche at this point and in our assumptions of what is good and bad. We have been doing this now for almost 200 years. For almost 200 years, large quantities of people, scaled up as the population has grown and tourism has grown, have traveled around the globe with the intention of having a positive impact on the places they visit for short periods of time that they have no background in, they have no cultural ties to, they have no specific knowledge of, they have no expertise to offer, and they have no intention of staying. And it's never worked. So this isn't a burgeoning like empire. It isn't a new product that we just haven't figured out. It's something we've been doing for 2 centuries and it's never worked. When we start from that place of understanding, it's a lot easier to continue the critique.
Definitely. I think that's one of the things that I have realized myself in any places that I've traveled to, and hearing about sort of all different types of volunteering trips or charity trips and everything. People seem to sort of separate that one particular, whether it's the point in time, the year that they're going, or just the place, from the context, from any historical context, from any colonial context, you know, just any cultural context of the place, the particular place that they're going, and not just Africa, the whole country, you know, or like Asia, that one house there, you know what I mean? It's like there's just a real, almost like a disregard of any context, and that's key to making any difference anywhere. And so with that, I'd like to ask you also, you yourself have said you have written about your experiences from quite a young age, from really being a teenager, and a little bit later. What are some of the changes or some of the sort of developments that you saw in that time working or like volunteering in that sort of traveling in that sort of way, if any, over the years?
Yeah,
People's
so for
attitudes or like what the trends were, trending places maybe, or activities on trips?
listeners, the first voluntourism trip that I took was when I was 16 years old. I went to Tanzania to volunteer at an orphanage and school for young women. There were not young children there. It was really like 11, 12 to 18-year-old girls. And I myself was a 16-year-old girl. I was about to turn 17. And I went with a group from my school, which I went to all-girls school. So it was an all-girls group going to an all-girls orphanage. And it felt sort of, as we were planning it, like this ultimate symbol of like female empowerment and do-goodery. And from the moment we got there, it was pretty clear that there were some core misunderstandings with what we thought we were capable of and what we were getting into and what was actually going on the ground. So what I wrote about in the piece that went viral was that we were there to build a library and we were entirely incapable of doing it. And I learned partway through the trip that at night, the workmen who were helping us were taking apart what we'd done and redoing it so we wouldn't know. But we'd be able to show up at the work site in the morning and continue as if nothing had changed. But that's actually, as I write about in the book, it's a shocking thing. It's not rare. It's actually a very common occurrence that voluntourists' lack of qualifications are hidden from themselves by host organizations as a way to keep them coming. But also, it wasn't the only thing that was wrong on the ground. I mean, one of the most simple things, for example, is that we spent a hell of a lot of money buying a lot of scientific calculators to bring in a duffel bag to give out to the girls, only to learn that they actually are not allowed to use calculators at their level because they're expected to do all their calculations in their national exams by hand. And so calculators are not allowed in the classroom because it would undermine their academic goals and outcomes. That was something that we could have known prior to spending a lot of money on calculators.
Something pretty basic, yeah.
Yeah, something pretty basic. Similarly, we brought a lot of hair ties and like, I don't know why to us, like hair ties was a smart thing. They were like funky. They weren't like just bands, but like
glittery scrunchies.
Like scrunchies. We did not know that part of their uniform was shaving their head. Literally, that would have been like so simple, such a simple thing to figure out. And so I'd love to think that my experiences were in some way an anomaly or that the industry has somehow moved past them. The reality is that things have really just continued to pace at a larger and larger and larger scale. And I say that even with COVID-19 and the current global pandemic. One of the really interesting things at this time is that I've gotten a lot of journalists who've reached out to me who've said, hey, now that voluntourism is on pause, what do you think is going to happen in the industry? How's it going to change? Voluntourism actually never stopped. A few trip providers, which I say trip providers because voluntourism products are often thought of as nonprofits selling a trip. Most voluntourism trip providers are actually for-profit companies. Good thing to remember always is just because someone uses a .org, as in .organization URL, does not mean that they are a nonprofit organization. So always, that's one of the things we need to do as travelers with research is know who you're traveling with. And being a nonprofit does not make you better than being a for-profit, but voluntourism trip providers have kept going. They've kept selling trips. And in fact, there are many that have published blog posts written by travelers about how beneficial to them their trip during COVID was. Going to, for example, Tanzania. And in Tanzania, there's been very significant issues around vaccine accessibility and healthcare protocols and safety. And they did not close their borders to Americans. And so Americans were still able to fly in and potentially bring a deadly virus with them to a place that does not have the medical system to take care of that. And so even a global pandemic could not stop people from wanting to do good. I think that the section of voluntourism that most flies under the radar is missionary trips. And it flies under the radar only because it's really only talked about by a pretty small, I mean, it's large, it's billions of people around the globe, but a pretty segmented, it's Christians. It's a pretty insular group.
Christians even, not just any Christians.
Yeah, it's predominantly evangelical Christians. Missionary work is not unique to evangelicals, but the short-term mission culture is very central to evangelicals in America and Australia. And that's just continued apace. And so for me, on one end, like, I'd love to be able to say there's been this massive change in the last decade. I was 16 when I went. I'm almost 29 now. Really, it's just continued exactly the same.
Interesting. And Julian says, interestingly, it was not allowed to travel out of the UK for most of last year, but you could travel to volunteer. So that's even in, government regulations. People were allowed to leave the country to volunteer. And I actually did meet a couple of volunteers here in Nairobi in, it would have been January, who were like, we were out at a bar once they were open. And there were just a few guys, telling me they were, I don't know if they were with the military or not, but they were just like, yeah, we're here like working at a school. What you mean? Schools are closed. Yeah, we just came to help them. Help who? Doing what, sweetie? Here are no answers really. So.
But those are good questions and they're important questions. The problem is that the answer for most voluntourists is really irrelevant, because the experience isn't about actually manifesting good in the sense of better, more fulfilling, more stable lives for people. Because every single human on planet Earth deserves access to education. Every human deserves access to high quality healthcare. Every human deserves access to job training. If voluntourism genuinely provided those things, I would have a lot harder time critiquing it, but it doesn't. And I think that's one of the core things here, is that people think that they're buying into a product that is improving people's lives, but in fact, they're buying into a product that is exacerbating patterns of exploitation.
So that the
there are
industry
entire
can continue.
communities. Yeah, exactly. It's a cycle. And sometimes the way that I break it down for people, really, orphanages is like the easiest thing to talk about because it's the most clear-cut ethically. Orphanages are bad. Done. There is no such thing as a good orphanage. Done. You can argue with me, you won't, but argue with me about it for days. They don't exist. There are good people who have started orphanages. That does not make their orphanage good. There are orphanages that are that strive to provide their kids with genuinely the best possible resources. That does not make that orphanage good. Orphanages harm children. Institutionalization harms children. We know this. And yet we continue to buy into the idea that, and you were speaking earlier to like exceptionalism and how people excuse their singular behavior without looking at the broader system. We buy into the idea that if I, as an individual, go somewhere in good faith with good intentions that looks like a good place, it must not be that bad. And I must not be exacerbating harm and contributing to harm because
my intentions are X, right?
Exactly. And unfortunately, that's simply not the case. We are buying into and exacerbating a system that results in global child trafficking. I mean, Definitely. 80% of children who live in orphanages globally are not orphans. Most children in orphanages globally have parents who'd be willing to care for them or family members. Sorry.
I wanna segue into that because, like I said, I spent the bulk of 2020 in Jinja, Uganda. I was there. What I do most of the time is I have volunteered in the sense that I have done many work stays. So the way that I've traveled for cheap is to barter skills in order to stay somewhere for free. So I will run people's social media, or I'll update their website for them and be there for a few months, whereas I could never have afforded like a full Airbnb to myself, for example. So that has been my foray into voluntourism. And also there are, so we'll get into this later, but there are, you know, websites and platforms where you can kind of book directly with whether it's a homestay or a small project. I've done a lot of these things at backpackers and hostels. So you're able to directly communicate with them. And I'm not paying $2,000 for like, you know, one of these organized programs type of thing. So that's that. While I was in Uganda, again, Ginger is a lot of the places where the sorts of things I want to do are common. And also I travel very much in the past few years, just here in East Africa and in Southern Africa very much. So a lot of these places, of course, are, you know, in the global South, previously colonized countries, have quite a lot of good in them and, you know, beautiful landscapes and people doing well and a lot of poverty at the same time. So they attract this sort of huge volunteerism industry. Once or twice, I would get asked by certain people, you know, there's somebody, a friend of mine, or, you know, just by local people in Jinja. I distinctly remember one time, a motorbike rider, boda rider, that's a form of public transport in Uganda, came to me and said, a friend of mine was just wondering, she's sort of looking for people who are willing to, he said it in Kiswahili, he said, kununua watoto. He was like, somebody, you know, wants to know, like, you know, there's some Wazungus or white people, foreigners who buy children. Do you know of anybody looking for a child? I was like, what? He was like, yeah, do you know of anybody looking for a child? I was like, I was very confused. I was like, what do you mean to buy the child? I'm really confused. What are you talking about? Many times, a lot of these people with they're very sketchy adoptions, which don't really go through the proper legal routes, which are long and complicated, I would bet, in many countries. But there are many people who either go to a family who look like they're struggling and say to them, hey, I'm going to just like take your kid to school. Maybe they'll say it's in that country. Maybe they'll say they're taking them abroad. You know, I'll educate them and everything, you know, give them a better life. And it's either lost in translation literally because of language, or all the information is withheld from this child's birth family. But often the birth family doesn't know this means they're giving up their kid for good. They just think they're being taken to school and brought back. And years later, they're like, where's my child? And there's no real point of contact, and there's no, you know, real way of tracing where their child is. And there's no legal framework really to pursue it. And that's extremely common in the orphanage and like international adoptions type of thing. A lot of it is still sort of like not heavily regulated. I know that quite recently Ethiopia has like put a stamp on, put a stop to international adoptions. I'm not sure about the details of that. If anybody knows, they can pop it in the chat. So that is one very common thing, at least in Uganda. But I do also want to move on from that and say somebody has asked about other forms of volunteering, because we've spoken about children and orphanages a lot, but there's a lot to do with medical volunteering. There's a lot of ecological and conservation volunteering. And is that harmful as well, or as harmful or bad?
Yeah, so really interesting question. I saw it come up and I was really excited that it was asked, because actually it's something that I don't really get into in the book for a variety of reasons that I can sort of touch on here. If I were to create a hierarchy of terrible, conservation and scientifically focused voluntourism would be at the very bottom of that hierarchy of terrible. It is less terrible. The problem is that many of the trip providers that sell conservation voluntourism opportunities, such as going and helping with like a rabies vaccine clinic for street dogs, or working at an animal conservation facility, or counting birds as they migrate, many of those trip providers are also selling the very, very, very harmful products. So by purchasing one, you're still supporting a practice that is inherently harming individuals. You might not be buying that product, but you are supporting the trip provider as a whole.
What sorts of products are you talking about in that example?
So, for example, a trip provider that offers conservation volunteering might also offer going and teaching at a school in Ecuador that is open to 16-year-olds with no teaching degree, or going and doing medical volunteering in South Africa. You can't do that right now, pretty fairly sure, in the Dominican Republic, for people who aren't even pre-med yet. Like there's just because they offer one product that's okay does not make the overall thing okay. Parallel to that, by allowing yourself to buy into the industry as a concept, you are empowering other people to buy into the industry as a concept. So I think about this a lot with how we consume like fast fashion, where, for example, like H&M has an eco line of like organic cotton.
But what about
when you buy that organic shirt, you might feel better about it. You might only have organic cotton on your body, but you're actually funding the creation of all those things that you don't want on your body that they're also selling. It's the exact same thing. And it's very easy, again, back to exceptionalism, it's very easy to think about ourselves as individual actors separate from these global systems and separate from these larger economic systems. My hope is that we as informed and curious, engaged individuals can start to see through that and say, actually, I'm not going to buy into this. Now, there are some exceptions to this. So, for example, if you are in a high-level education program focused on a specific species of lemur in Madagascar, and you get a research position working with that species of lemur, I don't consider that voluntourism. That is global scientific research furthering academic study on a global level. A little bit different. Doesn't mean there aren't still problems with it. Doesn't mean that it is immune from any critique. But I categorize it separately than this conversation. There's also trip providers who worked really hard to disentangle themselves from some of the most problematic parts. So like World Challenge is a good example. World Challenge predominantly works with young students, and until a number of years ago offered teaching volunteerism, offered orphanage trips, but they chose, working with a really fascinating consultant, Lee Matthews, to transition out of those experiences and focus the vast majority, and I think soon to be all of what they do, on conservation and scientific work, so that they are not contributing as a massive company that has thousands of people traveling with them every year to really the worst of the worst that's going on. Again, does that mean that what they're doing is perfect? Absolutely not. Tourism itself is an imperfect exercise. Tourism itself is something that is embedded in a privilege hierarchy, regardless of what we do, what our individual skin color is. The fact that I can book a flight to Tanzania and someone from Tanzania cannot simply come here, that is a privilege exchange. And until we recognize that as also as much a part of this as precisely what products you're buying, we're actually not making any real move. Does that make sense?
Definitely, I hear you. Rahab in the comments is giving a lot of information about some alternatives to orphanages and everything. I'm very happy to see everybody, interacting like this in the comments. I always say to people, in your move to trying to decolonize your travel and the way that you think about travel, I feel like the first step is just to be easy on yourself. Like, don't beat yourself up about not knowing things or, having done things that are messed up before, just simply because you didn't know or you just didn't think about it, just because you didn't consider that it might be a damage. Because a lot of the time, what is mainstream in tourism, especially again to previously colonized countries, it's born out of colonialism. It's born out of the exploitation and the exclusion of the people from that place. Speaking of which, conservation, I'll speak again for Kenya. A lot of our conservation areas and where people will go on safari and everything. First of all, safaris came out of hunting parties for the British aristocracy. And when that was outlawed in the 70s, then things were sort of switched into, okay, come and like go on game drives and check out the animals, but still it's inching out the native peoples of those lands. A lot of them who are the Maasai and the Samburu, even if you don't recognize those names, you have definitely seen pictures of them because now they're used as props. And these are their indigenous lands, and they are being pushed out until today. It's only very recently that I learned of a conservancy called Nashulai outside of the Masai Mara, which is the country's first Maasai-owned conservancy. And I would think if you are interested in going into conservation or ecological work, the question of land ownership and land rights is very, very major. And that's, that's the same as the United States. A lot of US national parks are on indigenous land. And it's, it's a question mark. It's a question mark a lot of the time. I've got another question here is, let me just read it out. Thanks for all your interaction, guys. This is really fun. Julian asks, what do you think about independent volunteering arranged directly with the organization on the ground instead of a formal provider? I know several wildlife researchers who have had volunteers who help them with data collection, and we've spoken about being a citizen scientist like that. So what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, and I'm going to combine that a little bit with Julian's question above it on running a luxury travel company and having people travel with him asking for opportunities. So just to answer the second one first, say no. If you are questioning whether you should provide them with what they're asking for so that you can make money, I'm sorry, Julian, I don't mean this personally. It's the wrong decision and you're operating from the wrong place. That is simply not, what a traveler wants is not what they should be handed every time they ask for it. Just because someone says they're willing to pay a couple $1,000 extra to hang out with Black kids doesn't mean you should hand them a couple Black kids and say, go have fun. And the reality, as harsh as that wording is that's what people are doing. They're trying to buy access to other people's lives. When it comes to working with organizations on the ground directly, these same issues are still at play. Just because the organization said it's okay you take pictures with our kids rather than you going through a trip provider doesn't mean that you're not still exacerbating very real problems. And yes, like colonialism and white privilege is a huge part of this, but there's aspects that really have nothing to do with race. So for example, something I read about in the book is attachment disorders. We know globally, the medical, whatever it is globally knows that children need reliable role models that are there and that stay. We know that having people cycle in and out of someone's life at a young age is extraordinarily harmful. This is not something that's up for debate. And when we excuse empowering inappropriate relationships between visitors and vulnerable people, and by vulnerable, I do not mean because they are in a different socioeconomic status, I mean literally because they're children, that is causing harm. And I understand why it's complicated for people sometimes because, for example, I took some friends to Haiti in 2015 or 16. So I worked in the Dominican Republic for a significant period of time, first in voluntourism with a HIV/AIDS impacted and infected pediatric population, and then later with a alternative tourism organization. And while working at that tourism organization, we did a trip into Haiti that was to visit different social impact projects on the ground. So we did a series of visits, just sort of seeing what was working and what wasn't working and hearing from them about how they could be supported. And one of the things that I asked of the people who traveled with us was that they not take pictures of children. Take photos, just don't take pictures of kids. Just don't do it. Within
what was the reception to that?
Well, within like 6 hours, they were taking pictures of kids. Everyone said they were okay with it. And these are people who I respect and they're friends of mine.
Oh, but they said yes. I asked them, they said yes. Okay.
Yeah, I asked. Well, that's the thing is they said, I asked and they said yes. And the problem is that it is a extremely fraught relationship. And Susan Sontag, if we're going to go to like really classic writing on photography, writes about how the camera is an act of violence. Teju Cole has some very important writing on the camera as a colonialist weapon. Simply going into spaces with cameras is a power, it's like walking in with a gun in many ways. Like it is a power play. It's an imbalance. And so just because you're working directly with an organization does not solve these imbalances. Is that frustrating? Yes. Do I wish that I could say, you know, after 6 years of research, I've discovered that there's this perfect way to do voluntourism that just like you can do and buy right now, and it's even cheaper. That's not true. The reason this system is so broken is because we keep finding like a little bit better options that actually are not better. And then we put all of our hope and our energy and our like goodwill into those things, and they create just as much toxicity and harm on the ground. But we excuse them because we think they're a little bit better. And really the thing we need to be doing is if someone says they want to travel somewhere to volunteer, ask why. And also actually follow it up with, you know, what kind of volunteering do you do at home?
Talk about it.
Because it is rare that people who do voluntourism are actually actively involved in volunteering in their own communities. I can say that the 1 hour that I spend at my local food pantry every Tuesday is the hardest volunteer gig I've ever had. It's not because the work is hard. It's because showing up every single week is hard. Volunteering should be
and
hard.
long term.
Consistency is hard. Giving to your community is hard when you commit to it over the long term. And that's what we need to be doing. When we travel, stay local, eat local, hire local guides, find local makers, visit local initiatives on the ground and learn about what they're doing and ask really thoughtful questions, and perhaps donate as a thank you for the tours that they give you. But stop with the urge to pick up a shovel. It's simply not necessary. It's only to fulfill our own internalized needs. It's not actually creating good.
I'm going to hop on that point as well. And there are a few questions and comments about, well, actually what Julian was asking is like what you should say if somebody comes to you and they want to do that. And if you yourself have this in your mind, ask those questions like, what have you done at home? Why there? Why this thing? Why you? I think a lot of the time people will hear about, you know, a cause or a community, and sometimes the urge to sort of center themselves is a little bit larger than like the urge to step back, do some research, speak to whoever's already on the ground and see what would be helpful and what would not, and see whether them being there, whether physically or, you know, even talking about it in public and spreading awareness, whether that would in fact be helpful. And a lot of what's missing, I find, is the actual community and the affected people, the actual affected people and their needs and their opinions. You know what I'm saying? If you were to come again, like you're talking about, let's get some scrunchies and calculators, only to get there and realize this is not at all useful. And what might be useful is, I don't know, maybe sanitary products or something like that, or some sort of something else. You know, that's just an example out of thin air. So I think that do you know anybody who runs sort of tours or activities or is a trip planner? I think a great way to go might be if you maybe have like, whether you have a blog on your website or anything like that, to have these questions laid out and, you know, just like give people time to reflect on why they want to do that, why they want to do it there. If it is something that requires a particular skill or qualification, would they be qualified to do that at home? And if not, why can they go somewhere else and do it? If you could not give somebody an IV where you live, why can you go to Gambia and do it? If you could not, you know, go into a children's home and work with children with learning disabilities, why can you do it in Belize? And really, really, really think about that, particularly with, would this be allowed where you're from? And why or why not?
Well, and often people will say, well, I'm going to do voluntourism because I can't do X here. The fact that that is the logic is extraordinarily disturbing. If you do not have the right to practice drawing blood on someone in your own country as an 18-year-old, why in the frickin' world do you think that someone else should be the victim to your mistakes? Like and in many ways, like, it's funny, Rachel was noting in the chat about like harshness. I know that I'm quite harsh about these things, but I use the term zooification. It's a dehumanizing of people. It is a assumption that the whole, like, this is better than nothing. That is dehumanizing. That is saying that someone else's children, someone else's family deserves less. Because whatever you can offer is better than nothing. No, it's not. It also assumes that what they want for their life is what you want for your life. And I know, especially in the US right now, I definitely do not want to be exporting our values to other places as if what we have is better than what they have. And it's insane hierarchy. And I think that really what we need to do is be more mindful of traveling as students, traveling of students of the world who want to genuinely understand, and to be entirely transparent. The more that I've studied tourism, the less I've traveled. And I felt very bad for my husband when we were planning our honeymoon, because the first like 6 places he listed as possibilities, I was like, that we can't do that. I can't go there because I don't know an ethical way that I would feel comfortable going there. I would love to be able to book a like 5-day stay at an all-inclusive right on a beach with unlimited rum punch and feel good about it. Because I know that in many ways, my body would enjoy that. But my mind isn't okay with it. My mind isn't okay with it. And I've had to put my want to lay on that beach behind how I've decided to value other people's lives and livelihoods. That's called being a more evolved human, which is not to say I'm the most evolved human on the planet. I have as many foibles as anyone else. But we need to start putting other people's lives above our own. I saw something in the comments that I wanted to, I'm just trying to scroll. Sorry, I'm like, okay, so there's a question around legitimate opportunities for helping with community-based tourism projects, particularly for individuals with relevant educational backgrounds. So I do not have like a list off the top of my head. However, one organization that I think is quite interesting is called La Chaza Chula. It is in, I'm not even going to specify because my brain will get it wrong. It's in South or Central America. And what they do is that they have long-term internship programs that require prior experience, and they have an equal number of local and I think they might even have more local interns. But they're hiring locals alongside having people come in, and they work together. They exchange expertise back and forth. And the idea is to build greater awareness, not awareness, depth in the workforce locally. And that's really, for me, when I see things that are exchanges of expertise done right, that can work. Teaching, I've seen some really interesting teacher exchanges where qualified teachers from one country will go to another country and train alongside
Qualified.
teachers. Qualified, yes, keyword qualified. And by qualified, I do not mean enthusiastic. I mean, they actually have the certificates. Like, that's one of the unfortunate things in voluntourism, is that often enthusiasm is considered a qualification. It is not a qualification. But those types of opportunities are often have a higher bar to entry than most people who want to do voluntourism want to or are capable of clearing. Most people who'd want to do voluntourism are not nurses, they're not teachers, they're not doctors, they're not engineers. I can tell you, accountants, I would love if more accountants wanted to work one-on-one with nonprofits in countries outside of their own who need someone on their team to learn bookkeeping. That is a skill. that is something that can be exchanged. That is something that you can really invest in the place. It also does not involve putting kids on your lap. And that to me is like, that's the unsexy stuff. That's the stuff that's complicated. We have a question here that's a bit long. Were you able to take a look at the gray area with residential facilities for kids? Yeah, so just really quickly, Allison, if anyone is telling you they're in desperate need of volunteers to come, do not talk to them or work with them.
Ooh.
That is unethical. That is
Why
unethical.
do you say this?
What?
Why do you say this?
Because if children have been pulled from their homes, that means they're extraordinarily vulnerable. And if a government is willing to throw unqualified people in to work with those children, that's terrible. Now, there is a argument around, again, back to something's better than nothing, but these kids will not have the care they need unless white hands show up. Something that Julie and I were talking about prior to this conversation is issues of enabling and excusing. Governments in many of the countries that allow voluntourism have empowered voluntourism to exist by allowing voluntourism to become a pseudo-social service. They have separated themselves from their responsibility to their citizens by assuming that predominantly white Westerners will show up and fill in the gaps. That's not okay.
For sure.
That's just not okay.
That brings me to one of the reasons I was very happy to do this, to have this discussion. And also I'm very happy to talk about this with people who are not necessarily Westerners. Because for those of us over here in you know, these countries in question that attract a lot of volunteers and voluntourism, there is still a lot of enabling. So like this question talks about Black South Africans who are trying to do work for their community. First of all, maybe they don't even really approach it in that way and approach it in the way that's harmful for the children or for whatever project it is. But it does happen very often that people see a business opportunity, right? People see volunteers come in and they'll buy you stuff and they'll pay you to stay in your home or whatever it is. And that becomes an individual source of profit for themselves. And so, you know, it's like, it's more discernment. It's very tricky. It just because, you know, it is a face of a person from that country, or it's not a white face, as an example, even though it may well be, that doesn't mean that it's right. That doesn't mean that it's ethically done, you know? And so for those of us who are here like me in Kenya or somewhere else in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, South America, any of these places where you know for a fact there is very much volunteerism and there is a lot of, this industry is booming. It also, if this interests you, is on you as well to not enable this. Again, one of the formative experiences for me in this topic, I suppose, I volunteered at a different project again, using, I think Julian asked as well about directly booking with organizations or individuals instead of these sort of third-party trip planners. Often I use certain websites. I don't know if I should mention them. I'm not going to mention them. But where you really just book a work stay. So this particular one was just with a family, right, really close by. Mfangano Island is in Lake Victoria, what we call Namlolwe on our side of the lake. It's an island called Mfangano Island, very beautiful, very like kind of untouched and not very well known. And I was always intrigued by it. But there are like 2 little lodges and 1 luxury camp, and I couldn't afford it. I wanted to be there for like a few weeks. So I booked a work stay with this family, and they were running a permaculture project, and they said, you know, we could use some new pictures for our social media and maybe, you know, some blog posts. I was like, I can do that, easy. So I went. It was myself and a French volunteer, a really cool girl who I'm still friends with now. And this little island, I'm so bad with numbers. I don't really know like the population, but I definitely remember going on this website and seeing 12, 15 listings for volunteers saying, come and work with vulnerable children, come and help with this, you know, and like, come and help with our permaculture project. Not really understanding what permaculture is. They were just like, boom, this is what the people want. This is what we're going to say. Like, we're going with it. It's the, you know, it's the new buzzword for the island. And I remember getting there, and my host family, who are lovely people, and I'm actually planning on going to visit them sometime soon again. Their whole project was a permaculture project, which was the wife had a certification in permaculture, and she wanted to eventually develop a training center for the women in the area. And so we were like at the very, very beginning stages of that. And the man had read that I had some experience in architecture, so he wanted my help kind of planning it out and drawing out what the training center was going to look like. And so one section was going to be a nursery, and then there was going to be where the women would have their training in permaculture. And I remember asking him, so who's going to take care of the nursery? Like, who's going to take care of these women's kids? And he said, oh, volunteers like you guys. I said, okay. So the other volunteer and I just kind of showed up. There was no real check for any experience in anything. I know I said in my profile I have a degree in architecture. You didn't ask for it. This other volunteer had just been on a trip up and down Asia, also working in schools and everything. She wasn't asked about a criminal record. Let's not even get into that. Let's not even go there. A criminal record or any experience in childcare, any qualification or training in any particular childcare. And I said this to him, and he was just like, oh, but you know, it's fine. Like, there are so many volunteers who come around here. We're just kind of used to this. And we were staying at his house, even though we had sort of like another outhouse in their compound. And he lived there with his 3 young daughters, from about 8 years old to like 19 was the oldest. And they had male volunteers there before, and like all sorts of things could happen. You really just don't know who you're inviting to your home. And I said this to him, and I would say to him, okay, well, you know, what is your plan for like when you start involving children and visits to schools and everything? And I remember him saying to me, but if somebody wants to volunteer, you can't stop them. I said, this is literally your house. What do you mean? And I think in these sorts of environments where people might be, you know, struggling economically, particularly at a time like now after this whole COVID pandemic, there is a sort of, sometimes there's a little bit of desperation, and sometimes it's a bit of greed. And people, again, just see volunteers as moneymakers, even if they are not a third-party big company who are planning an entire trip. You know what I mean? So the fact that they are from that country doesn't automatically make it okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that, yeah, just because the people that you're visiting or staying with or working with are native to the country that you are going to does not mean that the choices that they are making by allowing you to be there are actually empowering their community. They may be benefiting financially from it, but it does not assume that they will be making decisions that are the best on behalf of their community as a whole. I know some people are probably going to have to jump off because we're like hitting the hour right now. So I just want to like plug. This is Ours to Explore, Privilege, Power, and the Paradox of Voluntourism. I got my own subtitle right. If you order the book, you'll get a discount code through ITA. If you order the book and then email me your confirmation, I'll put my email in the chat. I will send you a signed book plate, like that says like your name and like, thank you for reading, explore carefully, Pippa. That's just fun to stick in it. It's just cute. That's like the whole point of it. And it's COVID, so it's fun to do it. Really quickly, because you were talking about work exchange and WOOF, and that came up in the chat with WOOF and these sort of work exchange opportunities. There was a really interesting article, I believe in the New York Times recently, about how agricultural work exchange has a complicated legacy and is not necessarily, it is helping individual farms often, but not helping overall economic systems. And I think that that's one, a very valid criticism, but also speaks to sort of the larger conversation that we're having around voluntourism and volunteering and tourism in general, is that as supposedly autonomous individuals, we're often driven to make decisions based on what feels best for ourselves, benefits ourselves, and sort of looks good within a pretty narrow frame of reference. And the challenge for us as we continue as people who engage globally with the world is to start thinking more systemically and thinking about how the decisions that we make and the systems that we choose to buy into, whether we choose to or not, often it's not our choice, are impacted by our decisions, even if our decisions are only tiny drops in the bucket. And I think that it gets complicated. It gets really, really complicated. It's why I do not, when someone contacts me and says, I want to volunteer, what can I do? I say, don't volunteer. Just don't do it. When
Which
they
we
say,
have
I
some
want to,
questions about that. I just want to quickly mention this. We have some questions about, okay, so what should we do? Because we've spent an hour talking about, don't do this. But I would say,
I'm going to jump in super quick because I do want to close on that topic. So just, yes. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in there. Again, this is being recorded, so everyone will receive that recording afterwards. The book discount code should already be in your inbox as well. The fact that we're a couple of minutes over today does show how much there is to unpack with all of this. There's certainly a lot. We have a lot more resources that are available on our website, which is impactttravelalliance.org. Our latest Read, Watch, Listen series, which is a roundup of recommendations on podcasts, movies, articles, books to read more and learn more about this topic. Those are all on our homepage right now, so you'll be able to see those. We also recently ran an event with our Denmark chapter on finding and identifying voluntourism experiences that aren't bad for the world and figuring out which ones work well for you, which ones go beyond just making you feel good and are actually doing good. So we do have a lot of those resources that are rounded up on our website at impactttravelalliance.org. And last but not least, we do have an event later this month. We have it a week from today. It is our monthly traveler meetup. Of course, there's a lot of different perspectives here. It's not a black and white issue. So we're inviting our community to come together and share their own perspectives as well. I will throw that into the chat. These are interactive events where we invite everyone to come in, share their perspective, learn from one another, continue to grow. I think that that's so crucial, having these conversations, the fact that we can actually talk to one another in this digital era and say, okay, this is where we're at. How can we move forward in a way that's really addressing these systemic issues and saying, let's build back in a way that is more impactful for everyone moving forward. A couple of the themes that you all touched upon today, which I think are just kind of great topics to make a note of and kind of glean as key takeaways from this is number one, the voluntourism industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So when you're going and you're volunteering, you're a part of a system that is an industry, and it's a huge industry at that. Second of all, to Pippa's point and Julie's point at which we started today's event, it's an industry and a system that has existed long before our lifetimes. So these are things that we have been born into and that we're learning how to navigate and improve for things that are not things that we created. So I think that that's really important to keep in mind as well. If you're interested in diving deeper into that topic, we do have a session that we did with Dr. Anu Taranath, which is on her book called Beyond Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World. And you can see that on our YouTube. And I think that that's a really great way. Her book is probably better than that discussion as well. It's one of the most thoughtful books that I've read in the last couple of years about looking at the way that we think critically about our own identity and how we're navigating the world as well. So those are just a couple of, again, key points from what you all were talking about. I know, again, that we talked, you touched a lot upon the negative impacts from voluntourism, but at the end of the day, it does exist. I don't think that our online event is going to take down the entire industry. So I want to throw that back to you, Julie, and I know that
but
you
it's
were
a
getting
start,
into
Kelly.
It can be reshaped and reinvented. And I think that that's where a lot of the potential from these conversations come. And again, really prioritizing local voices, prioritizing having these conversations, whether they're difficult or hard, or you don't want to hear them. There's a lot that we kind of need to sift through and figure out what it means. And again, how we can work toward a brighter future for all together. So on kind of that topic and looking toward a better future, I want to pass the mic back to each of you for a quick closing, and just thinking about what are your hopes for the tourism industry in a post-pandemic world.
Pippa, you can go.
Yeah. Voluntourism isn't going anywhere. The book, it's, and there's a comment on the, in the chat, the discount code that was sent out will work for the University of Nebraska Press.com. However, you can actually get the book from anywhere. You can get it from Amazon. Please don't. You can get it from bookshop.org. You can get it from your local bookstore. Highly recommend. It's just about anywhere that you can buy a book. You can get the book. It's officially out, officially June 1st, but it's actually already shipping. So if you order it today, it'll be on its way to you. Voluntourism isn't going anywhere. And the intention to do good is, again, back to intention and enthusiasm, a really good intention. And I would like more people to want to operate in the world in a way that creates good. We need to be striving for a more equitable and just world. There's no way we're going to end up with a more equitable and just world if we don't have it. And recognizing that voluntourism has not historically led to more equitable and just world is a really important part of that process. My hope for people with travel is that every time they think about volunteering somewhere else, they'll volunteer at home. And every time they think of traveling somewhere, they'll actually do the research necessary to have a positive impact on the ground when they get there. And sometimes that means drinking a mojito from a locally owned bar on a locally accessible beach with a really pretty sunset. Sometimes that means the stuff that has sort of become almost demonized. We're not supposed to be allowed to relax when we travel. That's what slovenly people do. We're not supposed to be allowed to just relish how awesome it is to be somewhere new. That's what people who are bad tourists do. That's what tourists do. So we take on the word nomad, we take on the word adventurer, we take on the word change maker, and we throw a bunch of stuff into the mix and we say, I'm different because I don't do the sitting around on a beach drinking a mojito. Please just drink the mojito. Just do it. It's super fun. And that's okay. And read a book about the local politics there. I mean, when people tell me they're going to the Dominican Republic, I have a long list of things I want them to do. And that includes read a book. There's a book called Why the Cocks Fight. And I say, look, before you go to DR, read that book. If you haven't read it yet, cancel your ticket by the time you're supposed to get on the plane. Because if you're not willing to do the bare minimum to empower yourself as a student of the world to be a positive impact on the places you go as a traveler, you don't deserve to cross that border. And so earn it. Do the work before you go. And when you go, drink the mojito.
Word. That is really similar to what I was going to say is there's such an emphasis on like not being a tourist and, you know, like living like the locals and authentic. Listen, you're the tourist, okay? Just be a tourist. It's fine. It's fine. You're allowed to be a tourist. Go somewhere, spend your money in locally owned businesses, stay at a locally owned hotel or backpackers or B&B or whatever it is. There's a lot of talk on sustainability, and I think that the meaning of the word gets lost. But I think in this sense, you know, just break it down. To sustain. What does to sustain mean? It means you can keep going. So if you go to, again, I'm going to mention Nasrullah Conservancy. I'll see if I can type it in the chat later on. But, you know, you can go there, and you don't have to be the one replanting the trees in the riverbed restoration, but you can, become a patron and send a few dollars every month so that they're able to continue that even when you're gone. You know what I mean? You don't always need to center yourself, and you don't always need to be toiling somewhere. Go and relax, go and go to the cinema, go and watch a movie, go and talk to people, go and ask them, how do I say what's up in your language? Not hola, not jambo, how do I say what's up? You know what I mean? Just be the tourist, it's fine. And I think, just, keep educating yourself. Again, I always say to people, again, I'm going to say, don't be hard on yourself, be kind to yourself, as we are all learning, and I know that Pippa and I are very about this topic because we're very passionate about it, but that is not specifically against anybody, even the particular people I have called out. It's just a larger system that's got a lot of issues and that has us all bamboozled, you know what I mean? So just question everything, and just enjoy your life. Just don't worry about it.
And
don't overthink it.
Yeah, final thought on that, call other people into the conversation. Have this conversation with your friends and with your family, and in a way that invites other people to talk with you. Make it something that can be a place to build from, not something that cancels people or excludes them just because they don't necessarily agree. Really, the goal for me with the book from the get-go was not to even call anyone out. There's a lot of stories in it about what other people have done and ways that they've gone wrong. But really the message behind it is, do not do what we have done, do better. And that's such an important part of this. Is I am not speaking from some high horse of moral greatness. I made a shit ton of mistakes that probably hurt a lot of people. And when I made those mistakes, I was celebrated for them. I was told, you're changing the world and you're making a difference. You're an amazing person. And then when I called myself out, because I was really lucky timing-wise, and this wasn't a big conversation yet, I then got to be celebrated for having identified the ways I've hurt people. And so now I get told I'm more advanced on this subject just because I called myself out before someone else could post a picture of me on Instagram and say, isn't she terrible? And that's really disturbing to me, because it's so important that we open this conversation up to people, even who we disagree with, even who we may fundamentally not see eye to eye with, and say, hey, let's talk. Let's find some common ground. Let's find somewhere we can grow from, and let's become better and more understanding people together. Because, again, voluntourism isn't going anywhere. The desire to give back isn't going anywhere. The desire to travel isn't going anywhere, but we better be to start doing it better.
For sure. The last thing I'm going to say is, if you couldn't post it on Instagram, would you still want to do it? I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm sorry for taking up 20 minutes extra of your time, but we are so grateful that you have joined us. Like Kelly said, you'll get an email with whatever you need to know about ordering the book, and this replay will be on YouTube, so you can share it with people who weren't able to be here as well.
Thank you guys all so much.
Thank you all. Thank you both so much.